Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Real Forno Show. We're going to have some more fun conversation about the Minnesota Vikings NFL draft and some big picture thoughts from Pro Football Focus's Sam Monson on the Minnesota Vikings and their process. He is the lead NFL analyst for Pro Football Focus and co-host of the PFF NFL show. We're going to get his thoughts on what the Vikings did and how it makes sense and where there should be some red flags. Welcome to the Real Forno Show.
Welcome to the Real Forno Show, hosted by Tyler Forness, publisher at The Sporting News, contributor on SKOL North's Purple Daily, publisher of Substack Run In Shooter, the host of The Good, The Bad, and The Hungry on the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network, and a founding member of Vikings First and SKOL.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Real Forno Show. I'm your host, Tyler Forness. With me, as always, in the bottom right corner is producer Dave. To my left, PFF's lead NFL analyst and the co-host of the PFF NFL show. He is Mr. Sam Monson. Sam, how are you on this lovely evening?
I'm doing well, guys. How about you?
Doing great. Really excited about the whole NFL draft process and excited to kind of hear your thoughts because the Minnesota Vikings are in quite an interesting predicament's not the right word, but they're in quite an interesting situation in this era of transition. As kind of an overall scope, what are your thoughts on the direction of the Minnesota Vikings?
Yeah, I mean, this is the first time we got to see them sort of head in a completely different direction, right? We've been playing kind of kicking the can down the road with Kirk Cousins for years, and they finally put a stop date on that with the rolling 3-year guaranteed contracts. They let him test the open market. Atlanta gave him the better deal, and then that means you got to go find the next guy. So this was the kind of interesting chance to see what would they do. Would they get hyper aggressive and go after somebody, go try and get a Drake May, say number 3 overall, and then which quarterbacks were they going to prioritize? And this is the really interesting part of this post-draft period where you're trying to kind of read the tea leaves, right? And figure out who exactly was trying to do what, which quarterback rankings each team had. From what I can tell, it feels like the Vikings would have loved Drake May as the first option. Maybe JJ McCarthy was the second option. Either way, they were willing to play patiently and let that play out. You know, they had an aggressive offer on the table for Drake May. Once you couldn't get that done, we're not going crazy for anybody else, and we're going to be disciplined and try and keep the first round picks intact and get the next quarterback available that we can kind of wait and let fall to us. So I think this is a fascinating period to see how Kwesi actually wants to play all of these various elements, because you know, he gets talked about as this analytics GM, and obviously he has something of an analytics background, but really his main background is as a finance guy. You know, he came from Wall Street. So this is a very different background than most even analytically driven people. And I don't think they necessarily share the same kinds of approaches to everything.
Yeah, and I think that word analytics in itself is very interesting, because I think a lot of people associate analytics with Pro Football Focus, which is an obvious correlation, but analytics doesn't necessarily fall into one bucket. And like the general concept of analytics is utilizing data to try and find answers to a problem. And I think that element of Kwesi Adofo-Mensah as a stock market trader is really starting to kind of play into it. And we'll kind of tie that into the JJ McCarthy pick, because you mentioned they kind of decided, hey, we're going to stay patient. We're going to wait it out. Obviously, we know the results of that process ended up being a net positive for the Vikings. They keep their first round picks. They don't have to make a big trade. Did you think it was the right process to utilize, seeing how the Vikings were in this quote unquote desperate state to need a quarterback of the future, and they were flying off the board left and right?
Yeah, I think I like everything they did pretty much right up until the McCarthy pick was made. And then I think you can have there's a different conversation to be done with the Dallas Turner pick. But I think if I'm based off, it all depends what your individual rankings are on all these quarterbacks, right? And we tend to assume that everybody has them ranked the same and that they sort of work from the consensus board and these things are a static constant team to team. But the reality is clearly different. The Falcons, for example, obviously, evidently rank the quarterbacks in a completely different order to a lot of other teams. Otherwise, Michael Penix Jr. doesn't go at number 8 and he doesn't go ahead of guys like JJ McCarthy. And I think you can make the same case for a couple of other teams. So if in my rankings, I would have had Drake May as the second QB off the board. So at the point where he got past Washington, if I'm Minnesota, I'm trying to get to 3 to select Drake to select Drake May. I'm trying to make that trade happen with the Patriots, which it sounds like they did. I also, I wouldn't have gone crazy to make that trade happen. Like I would have offered them effectively the 3 first-round pick price tag that the 49ers had for Trey Lance a few years ago, but I wouldn't have gone much beyond that, if anything. So it sounds like New England wasn't willing to move off that pick without a ridiculous deal, that was so far in favor of them they couldn't turn it down. So I think that at that point, the Vikings are right to say, draw a line in the sand and say, no, look, here's the deal. It's fair. It's weighted in your favor because it's a quarterback, but we're not going any more than that. Like we're not, destroying our franchise to get this guy. And then at that point, I think the correct move was kind of what they did, which is wait it out. Like I don't think team, even though quarterbacks started coming off the board with Michael Penix Jr., I think that the next group were sufficiently they didn't blow you away as prospects that I think you could be disciplined, wait it out, almost certainly get one of them. And even if you can't, you could have potentially done something either, trading back or coming back next year and getting the quarterback at that point and just running with a stopgap. So I think at that point they did it. They were smart. You can argue whether they needed to trade up one spot with the Jets, but I don't really have a problem with that just to secure your guy and make sure the Raiders, for example, don't jump you. It doesn't look like they were going to based off the sort of phone calls that have come out from the Jets war room. There's been some video of that. It seems like Minnesota was really the only team on the phone at that point, but they couldn't have known that. So I don't really have a problem giving up that trade just to make sure you come away with McCarthy at that point. And then from that perspective, like if you cut off the draft right then, they've gotten JJ McCarthy and they didn't have to make the trade that everyone expected them to make to jump to number 4 or number 5 or whatever it is, right? They've gotten the guy they were expected to get, and it cost them a lot less than people were anticipating. So I think from that perspective, all good at that point.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one thing that I ended up talking about on my show on Monday is one of the big things that's responsible for the general manager is to understand the market. And we're going to have a bigger conversation about the process that Kwesi used, especially with that Dallas Turner trade. But how much blame or credit can you give Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah for making some of these trades? And for lack of a better term, as you kind of mentioned, it didn't seem like there were any other teams. He can't necessarily know that. But theoretically, it's his job to know some of those things. So how much blame can be placed on him for making that kind of trade, if any at all?
I mean, it's educated guesswork, though, at the point where the draft is actually going on, right? You can you can get a rough idea who wants to do what before the draft, but once the picks are flying in, and certainly once a pick like Michael Penix Jr. goes in, that completely shakes up the draft. Like nobody had that draft pick out there, right? So that as soon as that gets thrown in there, that is a grenade thrown into the middle of every mock draft that's been run for the last 3 months, including the ones the teams have been wargaming out, right? So at that point, all bets are off. And teams that you didn't think were going to move may be thinking about moving because suddenly a quarterback just went off the board that wasn't supposed to, and that reduces the number that are left and all these kinds of things. So again, I think they were right to kind of be disciplined and say, we're going to wait till our pick. But then once you get a pick away and there's still at least 2 teams out there that haven't taken a quarterback, I don't think you can criticize them too hard for jumping up one spot and just guaranteeing you get your guy.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree, but I think that plays into a big picture, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But before we move on, I want to talk about JJ McCarthy, the prospect. Where was he within your quarterback rankings? And I think it's been universally talked about that he is a quote unquote perfect fit for this system. Is it so much that he's a perfect fit for what Kevin O'Connell wants to do? or is it that all his infrastructure is going to be better than nearly any top 10 quarterback that we've seen since Patrick Mahomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Vikings are one of the best landing spots for any of the rookie quarterbacks. So,
Hmm.
almost regardless of which one they picked, we would be talking about it's a great fit, because it's a good situation for that quarterback. McCarthy, to me, the when we went through the tape of all these quarterback prospects, the more you went into it, the more to me it was this class is Caleb Williams number one, and then a gap, and then a bunch of guys that are pretty closely ranked. And it's sort of they're very different, and each one kind of depends, well, what is the thing that scares you the most, and what is the thing that you
Hmm.
like the most, and what is your risk tolerance for each red flag, and all those kinds of things. So I didn't have too much of an argument with anybody's rankings, sort of just depending on which thing that they gravitated towards. I would have had Drake May second. I think I had JJ McCarthy third, fourth, and Jaden Daniels third, but they're all very close together. And like
Hmm.
it's just a case of which thing for each guy scares you more than the others. For McCarthy, the thing is, we just haven't seen the same volume of tape in terms of him having to carry an offense the way some of these other guys have, right? And that's not to say that he can't
Yeah.
do that. It's just that we haven't seen him. He didn't need to. Michigan had this absolute, juggernaut of a team, of an offense. And so McCarthy was only asked to kind of steer the ship more than most of these other quarterbacks. And, when they did need him to pass, he generally passed pretty well. He had a really good PFF grade. The numbers are excellent. It's just that they could go the Penn State game and hand the ball off 38 straight times or whatever. And that isn't the case for
Hmm.
any of the other quarterbacks we're talking about, right? And where that becomes a problem is you can't necessarily rely on simply changing the sliders and scaling up the workload or the ask for JJ McCarthy and expecting his sort of his standard to stay the same. When you increase, the responsibility of these quarterbacks, it can change the whole dynamic and kind of how they're playing. So Caleb Williams is a good example. Like Caleb Williams knew that if they didn't score 40 in some games, they weren't winning, right? So he
Hmm.
couldn't afford to screw up a third down the way that JJ McCarthy did. And he knew that. And that's the same thing that's true with Jaden Daniels to a degree. Same thing that's true with Drake May. It's just a very different circumstances that JJ McCarthy was
Hmm.
dealing with. On the other hand, what he was doing was running NFL concepts, and NFL teams and coaches love seeing that. They love looking at like actual NFL plays on the college tape of the guys they're watching. So when we did see him throw the ball, we saw him running NFL
Hmm.
concepts and NFL schemes. We just didn't see as much of it as other people.
Yeah, and that's something that I was talking about pretty consistently over the course of the last, I don't know, 3 months. It's not that he can't; it's that we just don't know how much because the sample size is just smaller. And I'm really intrigued to kind of see how that progresses forward as my camera keeps going in and out. But I want to kind of move on to Dallas Turner because the idea of Dallas Turner to me is really intriguing. And before we get into the process of acquiring Dallas Turner, I'll just be honest. I had Chop Robinson as my edge one, and I had Turner as edge four. So I was a little different from consensus. Where did you kind of sit on Turner and how well he fits in with this Minnesota Vikings defense?
Yeah, I had Dallas Turner as my third best edge rusher in this class. I think Latu was the best edge rusher. I think Jared Verse is the second, and then I would have Turner third. It's a difficult needle to thread because on the one hand, he was the consensus top edge in this class. So my entire kind of pre-draft process almost felt negative about him because you're sort of pushing back against that. You're saying, hey, let's tap the brakes a little bit. He's this amazing athlete, but he's not quite as good as guys like even Latu in the same draft class, but other top edge rushers as well over the last few years in terms of production, in terms of PFF grading. On the other hand, he is very good. Like this isn't like a Trayvon Walker situation where you're looking at a guy and saying he's an amazing athlete, but he's actually not very good at football right now. Dallas Turner is a very good football player already and a good
Mm-hmm.
prospect, and he's been very productive. He just hasn't been as productive as guys like Latu and even Jared Verse and maybe even Chop Robinson, depending on the data points that you're looking at. But where Dallas Turner is kind of interesting is number one, he's obviously a special athlete, but number two, he played in a scheme where he dropped into coverage a lot more than some of these other guys,
Mm-hmm.
and that makes him particularly interesting, I think, for the Vikings defense and for that scheme and Brian Flores. Like, they were running these defenses where they're either rushing 3 or they're rushing 6 or 7, nothing in the middle. So these guys are stacked up at the line of scrimmage, but they may drop out and drop into coverage. And if you're looking at some of these other guys, they haven't done that at all, barely, a couple of snaps here or there. Whereas Dallas Turner was doing it fairly regularly. And obviously they signed Andrew Van Ginkel as well in free agency. It's another guy that's dropped into coverage a lot and rushed the passer. So all of a sudden, Minnesota's found a couple of these guys that can both rush the passer and drop into coverage at a pretty high level. And that, I think, makes him more interesting in the Viking scheme than I think he would have been in some other defenses.
Yeah, I agree completely. I was watching some of his tape earlier today against Tennessee, and there was a play where he's on the line of scrimmage and he's got to run with a running back, and he's like running it out and up, and he flipped his hips faster than Terrion Arnold. And I was like, what are we doing here? This is incredible. And I think if Flores can get him in the lab and get him play a little more under control, we could see something special. Now let's talk about the process in getting him. The trade in itself to go from 23 to 17 to give up that future capital is, for lack of a better term, a little bit concerning on my end. If you completely eliminate the trade from 23, which we can talk about if that's a worthwhile process or not, what did you think of that initial trade just to go from 17 to 23 and how they got there? Because it feels like I heard one conspiracy that they think they're going to get draft capital from the Falcons. So they're okay giving away more. And obviously they have at least one compensatory pick coming, but it felt really interesting to see Kwesi give up that much draft capital in the future to go get this guy.
Yeah, it was expensive. There's no way around that. Like that cost them a lot. They gave up, a third and a fourth round next year, a fifth round this year, right? I mean, a third and a fourth round pick are significant picks. Even if you just look this year at the players that were available at that kind of spot, we read out, 4 or 5 names that were within 20 picks of a sort of third round spot that was given away. It's legitimate players that you want to come away with, right? That's not an insignificant draft pick to give up. So, you can look at it in that and say that's a serious amount of capital to give up to make this move. Now, there's a few things involved, and this is where it's never black and white. It's always complicated, right? So, number one, if I had Dallas Turner ranked 3rd on my edge list, but as we said, he was the consensus number 1 edge rusher in this draft and supposed to come off the board with that 8th overall pick. So if they agreed with that, if they were in line with the consensus and they're like, Dallas Turner is the best defender in this draft, period. Like, not even the best edge rusher, the best overall defender. If they thought he was that caliber of player, like a genuine blue chip prospect that they couldn't possibly have expected to be available when they were picking at 23 or even within, striking distance of that, then that sort of changes the calculus a bit. And this is a bit like, Will Anderson a year ago, where they're like, we can come away with the quarterback and the best defender in this entire draft. It's just going to cost us next year's first round pick to do it. Like, if they think he's that special, you can argue that it's worth doing, or you can at least you can construct a case for that. And, they kept intact next year's first round pick. That's significant. They're going to get a 3rd round pick back in terms of comp picks. That's relevant as well. They're going to have a boatload of salary cap space that they can sort of chip away at and bring in some lower level veterans and sort of essentially replace a couple of mid-round draft picks. It's not necessarily the best process in the world to do it that way, but you can do it if you want to plan it that way. And then the one other thing I think is it is kind of worth at least considering what the picture looks like if you take those 2 first-round picks in, like if you put them together and use them as like a composite, and you say, well, the expectation pre-draft was Minnesota to use 11 and 23, trade up to 4, and come away with JJ McCarthy, right? That was probably the most common scenario that was mocked out, whether it was 4 or number 5. That was what everyone was expecting to happen. Well, they used 11 and 23 and a bunch of mid-round picks, and Jason Fitzgerald from Over the Cap sort of calculated it all out and said, effectively, it's the equivalent in value of pick number 5, I think, or pick number 4, one of the two. So effectively, they did do that, right? But instead of coming out with just JJ McCarthy, they came out with McCarthy and Dallas Turner. So from that perspective, it's positive EV, right? It's way better than they were expected to do. It's just that that move only happened after they'd already secured JJ McCarthy for a steal, right? So
Mhm.
I don't think they're getting a pick from Atlanta. Like, I don't think that's the way that's going to work at all. If Atlanta may well get punished and they may well lose draft picks, I think there's a almost 0% chance that Minnesota receives the picks in exchange. But I do
Mhm.
think that they're looking at this and saying, we're going to get a third back. We're going to have a load of salary cap space, and Dallas Turner is worth being this aggressive for.
Yeah, and one thing, as I kind of wrote about for Reef on Substack Wide Left, trying to understand Kwesi Adofo-Mensah's trades, what I found was across the board, when you look at the two market charts, the Jimmy Johnson, the Rich Hill, and then the three outcome charts, Chase Stewart, Fitzgerald Spielberger, and then PFF, he comes out relatively even when you encompass all 12 trades he's made since he took over as the Vikings general manager. But what I found interesting was when he's trading down, he's taking less in the market. So he's like selling a $5 pound of ground beef for $4. But when he's trading up, he's getting hyper aggressive. So my question for you is this: is he foregoing the idea of draft pick value, in return focusing on player value, like you talked about with Dallas Turner, consensus 9th overall player, picked at 17? If you take all that capital and you trade up to 9, you're getting an incredible surplus value. Is he looking at the player asset much more significantly than the draft pick asset and not worrying so much about that?
Yeah, I think so. And, when you're making all these deals, you always have to at least factor in what is your degree of confidence in the player you're actually selecting. Now, the lower
Mm-hmm.
down the draft you get, the more that becomes a bad way of doing things, just bad process, because, historically speaking, everybody is bad at identifying the difference between, the 35th best
Mm-hmm.
player in the draft and the 55th best player in the draft. But that
Yeah.
becomes less true the higher up the draft you get. And the higher up the draft you get, the more confidence you can have that the guy you're identifying is actually a significantly better player than some of the other guys. So I do think that absolutely the fact that it's Dallas Turner, and if they view him the way the consensus did, edge one, maybe defender number one, is a big
Mm-hmm.
part of this. And they're saying, look, he is a significantly better player than the guys that are going to be available to us, particularly if we go a different position at 23 and all of a sudden you're into the second tier of edge rushers. The gap between a Dallas Turner and a Chris Braswell or an Adisa Isaac, like, that's a big jump.
Mm-hmm.
Even historically in drafts, like the gap between the first tier of edge rushers and the sort of second tier that you think, we'll come back in the second round, we'll get the next wave, there's a terrible hit rate of those guys. So even if you're using the historical data, you can construct a good argument to say, if edge rusher is the position, go get that guy, because you're not going to find him lower
Mm-hmm.
down unless you get lucky. I definitely think that Kwesi is factoring in some form of confidence quotient in the evaluation of the player that he's identifying.
And it's very interesting. You kind of say that trade up for the edge rusher. It's been historically fruitful for the Vikings to take those mid round edge rushers, which is why the trade came off
Right.
as a little bit of a shock. But I want to kind of continue this conversation and talking about pick 108, and that is Kyrie Jackson from Oregon. I want your opinion on this, Sam. He's 25 years old. He worked 2 years in a grocery store, did the JUCO route at 2 junior colleges, and then went to Alabama for 2 years, played less than 300 snaps, and then started Oregon. He's had a really weird path. And one of the things that he said about him not playing so much at Alabama was, in his words, politics. Do you believe we're talking about other guys have these higher star ratings? Because he was in a room with 5 stars, Terrion Arnold, Brian Branch, and Kool-Aid McKinstry. Or is it something that Vikings fans should really be concerned with?
So this is a really weird draft because, and it might just be the start of a new kind of way of the new college football landscape, because of NIL, because of COVID,
Mm-hmm.
because of all these things that are operating together. You didn't need to get very far into this draft before you started finding a bunch of profiles that would normally be really concerning, right? Well, these guys They've only
Mm-hmm.
got 1 year of production, or they're already 25. They've been playing for 6 years, and all these sort of red flags in normal drafts. But actually, I think it's just kind of becoming the normal landscape. So Kyrie Jackson is one of them, but there were a load of guys on day 3, or even somebody like Xavier Leggett, who goes the bottom pick of the first round. Like Xavier Leggett
Mm-hmm.
has a if you took away, it just became player X, right? And you looked at player X and his statistical profile, there's a whole bunch of red flags in there that anybody that's been sort of projecting receivers into the NFL would say, don't touch this guy. Forget it. That's a massive no-no. Why didn't he break out until
Mm-hmm.
the final season? What was all these things? But there's reasons for a lot of them this year. And as I said, things like COVID and NIL are sort of changing the whole dynamic. So yeah, I think you're going to get more people like Kyrie who have kind of reasons or logical kind of explanations for why they weren't necessarily, they didn't have the cleanest pathway through. And like, he's definitely one of them that I think is worth taking a shot on, given
Mm-hmm.
his production, his ability, what we've seen on tape.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued to kind of see what his fit is with this Brian Flores defense. And for those of you joining, Sam Monson, the lead NFL analyst for PFF, is joining us here tonight. How do you think he fits in this defense? Because obviously he's 6'3.5", 194 pounds. He plays pretty well on press man, but the Vikings have not played a lot of press man due to what their cornerback room looks like. Is this a step towards playing a little bit more press man and a little bit less of that umbrella cover zero look, or are we looking for him to integrate into what Brian Flores did last year?
No, I think Brian Flores still wants to play some press man, or at least wants to have the option to do that. I think what
Mm-hmm.
we saw last season is Brian Flores did amazing things with smoke and mirrors for a lot of the season. But then late in the year, it felt like he'd run out of smoke and mirrors, and teams had started
Mm-hmm.
to figure out, how to actually attack it and where the weaknesses were. I think he would love just a few more options, just a few more clubs in the bag, so that he could change it up late in the year once things start to get figured out, or even if he needs to do that right away because it's the next evolution of the defense. So, a guy like Kyrie Jackson, man coverage skills is his forte, but unlike the other guys they've got, he's got the size and the length to be able to do it at the line of scrimmage and
Mm-hmm.
bump and run and get in a guy's face. So I think that's definitely a skill set that they are prioritizing and looking to try and add.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued to kind of see how he ends up fitting. And one guy who's going to fit really interesting in the land of 10,000 misses is Will Reichard, the kicker, picked at 203 overall. Where do you stand on Will Reichard, the prospect, and where do you stand on drafting specialists as a whole?
So as a prospect, he looks really good. He's I think got like the 4th highest PFF grade among kickers over the last few years. He's been extremely good. PFF grades in the 90s, all those kinds of things. I still would never draft a kicker. I just don't think it's too hard to figure out if you've got the guy that's actually going to be mentally bulletproof at the next level. Because really, outside of Justin Tucker, almost never none
Mm-hmm.
of them have been for like 20 years, right? These guys, you can get amazing kickers and they hit a wall and they all forget how to kick. They go through the yips and inevitably they get kicked out of the team that they were playing for, and maybe they'll rebuild their career and do it again, but they got to do it somewhere else because
Yeah.
you can't go through that as a team. So, and this happened a couple of times for the Vikings, right? They've had a guy who looked like a great kicker. The wheels completely fell off. They had to get rid of him, and he goes on to play really well somewhere else again, like Daniel Carlson for the Raiders.
Mm-hmm.
But and even though Daniel Carson's looked great for the Raiders, but we might be 6 weeks away from him doing it again and just the wheels fall off again. Justin Tucker is like the only guy that's been bulletproof for the whole way and has been consistently above and beyond anybody else. So unless you can guarantee you're getting Justin Tucker, and I don't see any evidence that teams are able to do that, it's just not worth taking the risk on him. You might as well just grab a guy undrafted. When the wheels fall off him, grab the next
Mm-hmm.
undrafted guy and just cycle through like that. I think you're way better off doing that. Now, I think there is some evidence to say you can prioritize punters that are better or easier to find, easier to identify than that, and you can target those guys on day 3. But this year, I just don't think a lot of teams necessarily needed a punter, so I don't think there was a
Mm-hmm.
ton of demand for those guys. But my rules of thumb would be: do not draft kickers at any point. But if you think a punter is good enough, go after him on day 3.
Do you think the idea of the Vikings drafted a kicker has anything to do with them running out of players on their board? I know that's been something that's been thrown around, but even so, shouldn't you maybe just have more players on your board at that point?
I think it's possible. I mean, this was again a weird draft. We heard, right away that like Jim Nagy was talking to us on our show around the Senior Bowl, and he was like, the day three depth of this draft is terrible. Like a bunch of
It was
guys we were
bad.
targeting for the Senior Bowl went back to school. We had to go deep into our board, let alone teams that are actually drafting all these guys, including underclassmen. So I think it was a very weak day three, and I think one of the consequences of that is teams that already draft from a smaller draft board than you would ever think they do, it's even smaller now because half a ton of these day three players went back. So I definitely think there were teams that were drafting into the end of this draft that were just taking shots at random players because whatever. I do think though that if you've reached that point and you're basically out of players on your board that you would be interested in, target something that feels like an upside pick, right? Find the freakiest
Hmm.
athlete still on the board and just grab him because what the hell, right? Find a guy that's got some kind of special trait and just grab him because, you might have been wrong, and if you are, he's got the talent to pay off big. A kicker just feels like a relatively low upside play at that point, and I don't really see the point in it.
Yeah, and I think it was Howie Roseman the other day that said if they're day three guys and you draft them, they got to be special. They got to have something special about them, and that's how they landed Jason Kelsey, Jordan Mailata. Those guys are special. And I completely with you. I'm against drafting kickers, but the Vikings went back to the trenches in round 7. Michael Juergens, center guard from Wake Forest. Watched a few plays of him, and he looks pretty intriguing. He's a 24-year-old, sixth-year guy, so he's got a lot of experience and some versatility. What do you like about Juergens, and do you think he's a good fit for Minnesota?
Yeah, he's got some really good zone blocking tape out there. He's been pretty productive both as a run blocker and as a pass protector. So I think it's a solid pick late in the draft. The Vikings, their offensive line has been improved, vastly improved the last couple of years. They've definitely taken steps in the
Hmm.
right direction, but particularly the interior, I think they can still at least take swings at and know that, there are upgradable spots there for them to target.
Yeah, and I'm really intrigued to kind of get some more tape on him and look into training camp. But the last pick was revealed earlier today as Kalen Kaler of the Athletics Prospect X, Levi Drake Rodriguez, and I'm in a Vikings Discord, and they found the Tropicana Bowl all 22 on YouTube and just started diving into it. And yeah, we're some real sickos around here, but he is a very interesting guy. And then reading about him, he spoke to his football team and got 63 of his teammates to get baptized. He talking to the Minnesota Vikings staff here. He's like, wait, if I get drafted, do I get a code? They're like, yeah. He's like, sweet. I'll just sleep here. Like, this guy seems to live and breathe everything that you want in a player. What do you know and like about Rodriguez? And also on top of it, can we make any correlation with the fact that the Vikings have drafted 3 of the last 5 players to be drafted from Texas A&M Commerce?
Yeah, the profile was really interesting on him. Obviously, he sounds like a great kid, and somebody from an attitude and a character standpoint that you absolutely want to bring on board. But he looks like a player
Mm-hmm.
as well. I mean,
Yeah.
he had the best grade amongst interior defenders at that FCS level. Like he was a dominant force at that level. Obviously, that level of competition is not good. And there's a bunch of players in this NFL draft who are NFL caliber players beating up on terrible competition, and that's one of those gambles that you take, right? It's a projection, a
Mm-hmm.
massive projection. Step up is huge, but that's the type of player that we were talking about before. Like those are the types of players I would be grabbing in the last couple of rounds, guys that were absolutely dominant at that level of competition, that have the traits and apparently are great characters as well, great kids. So get somebody like that and see if he can handle that kind of jump up in competition.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued about that, and thank you, Manju, for your super chat. We go back to Tuesday's episode yesterday. We talked a lot about strategy, and it had some mixed reviews, so some people not too happy with the conversation. But it kind of finished things off, Sam. I want to talk about this UDFA class, and The one guy that everybody's going to focus on, Gabriel Murphy, UCLA edge. To me, he fits the profile of the Vikings' next Ivan Pace Jr. A little bit undersized, undervalued at like pass rusher, because obviously Ivan Pace is a middle linebacker, but that was his specialty. He was rushing the passer, 9.5 sacks at Cincinnati his senior year. He didn't get drafted personally because he's got 30 and 3/4 inch arms. And even though Consensus Board had him as like a 4th round player, I gave him a 4th round grade on my film evaluation. What do you really like about him? And specifically, do you like or are you concerned with the fact that UCLA used him so much as a 3 technique on passing downs?
No, because I actually think that kind of gives you a template as the Viking. Like again, you talk about the sort of fit with Dallas Turner.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're one of the few teams that can put that guy in the A or the B gap, and have him on the field in sub packages inside in those kind of muddle looks where all the guys are at the line of scrimmage. Like, okay, Gabriel Murphy's got the size to be able to drop back into coverage, but if that guy gets a running start against a guard, good night. Like he's too fast and too quick, and he did a lot of that at UCLA. Like I think that's a really good template to show you how to use a guy and to hide the fact that he has short arms. There's every year when you do this, kind of focusing a lot on, the best players available and when is this guy going to come off the board and when is this guy going to come off the board. And it's only really when I start looking through the undrafted free agent signings, you're like, oh, wow, this guy didn't get drafted at all. And that Gabriel Murphy was one of those guys for me this year. I couldn't believe that he went undrafted, even with the short arms, because of this week day 3 draft we talked about. Like he has, I think, mid-round talent, 4th, 5th, whatever you want to put him. And for him to fall out of the draft entirely, given the lack of day 3 talent in this draft, I think is kind of crazy. Like he's too good for that. His production is crazy. He's extremely twitchy. He's a great athlete. And really it all does just come down to he's got short arms. But if there's ways of mitigating that and there's ways of moving him around, and you don't need to put him out there as a full-time 800 snap edge rusher against tackles that have arms 6 inches longer than his, there's ways to use them. And the Vikings showed that last year with guys like Ivan Pace. Like if you get a guy that's just a good football player who's athletic, you don't necessarily need to have the perfect measurable profile.
Yeah, 100%. And 2 more guys I want to ask you about, the Mercer wide receivers, because Ty James and Devon Harper, they were dominant at the FCS level last year. Both of them had over 1,000 yards. They helped Mercer into the FCS playoffs before they lost, I believe, in the 2nd round. What do you know about those guys, and do they project to be NFL caliber wide receivers in any way, shape, or form? I think maybe they can be like rotational guys, but I haven't been able to do a full-on film study of them yet.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I haven't either. When we do our draft stuff, me and Steve from the PFF NFL podcast, we come to the draft after the NFL season. We start in January, and there's only so deep into the class you can get with a full tape study. We've got other guys that have ground the film, and obviously Trevor Sikkema, our lead draft guy, who's going to done the whole draft guide and stuff. Yeah, I didn't make it as far as the Mercer wide receivers. I'm not gonna lie.
Hey, you know what? I have a lot of respect for somebody who just says, hey, I didn't watch him, because I do that all the time. I won't ever grade somebody I don't watch. But any final thoughts on kind of the Minnesota Vikings and how they project forward, Sam? Because as we talked about this entire show, they're just such a fascinating team to kind of see how this process ends up working out for them.
Yeah, and they're in a tough division now as well, right? Like they obviously went in a different direction from the previous regime, in part because they were kind of stuck in this wheel spinning area of being reasonable, pretty good playoff, maybe not playoff, depending on the year. But now you've got the Detroit Lions looking like they're trying to become one of the best teams in the NFC. You've got Green Bay, who's one of the youngest teams in the NFL, and yet still made the playoffs and look to be getting better. And then Chicago just rebuilt everything by getting Caleb Williams, who may be one of the best prospects to come along in years, and Rome Odunze, and Keenan Allen come on board as well. So the difficulty setting for the Vikings got ramped way up in the last couple of years. So it all comes down to whether they got the quarterback decision right. Obviously Justin Jefferson, the best wide receiver in the game. If they can get him locked up long term, get it done ASAP, and then try and build and give JJ McCarthy the best possible chance of success. But there's some really good talent on offense. The defense is a work in progress, but Brian Flores did an amazing job last year. I think it's going to be harder this year because just of the nature of the NFL. Defenses evolve year on year, offenses evolve. You got to stay a step ahead of everybody. And that's part of, the additions that they made in the draft are going to help them do that. But obviously JJ McCarthy is everything right now.
Yeah, it is everything. I'm fascinated to see how this plays out, and rookie camp starts, I believe, this weekend, and we'll get our first eyes on JJ McCarthy. Sam, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. I know Dave and I are thrilled that you were able to join us tonight. I know you and Steve have been doing a lot with the PFF NFL show, talking about the draft classes and stuff. Where can the people find you, and what else do you guys have going on throughout the offseason?
Yeah, PFF NFL podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, or we're on YouTube as well. You'll find it with the Pro Football Focus YouTube channel. We're doing division by division sort of draft recap shows. We just did the Norths, was it yesterday? So that's been out there for 24 hours or so. I think they're getting chopped up as well. So there'll be a Viking specific sort of shorter video that you can find. But yeah, that's where we are.
Perfect. Dave, do you have anything for Sam before we take off for the night?
Well, I just wanted to promote Pro Football Focus. It has been a tool that has helped fans across the board, as well as people in the industry, that we want to thank you for putting that product out and taking that step so long ago. Our mutual friend, Matthew Collar, helped write about it, and it's a wonderful tool, and we appreciate you, Sam.
Thanks for saying so.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, that is our show tonight. Thank you again, Sam, for joining us. Don't forget, Two Old Bloggers Sunday. Dave and Darren will be back, and we will be back next Monday, starting our film breakdowns of all the NFL draft prospects. From Sam, Dave, I'm Tyler. SKOL Vikings, everybody.
SKOL Vikings. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell to get notifications. It helps us grow this community that we all love, our Minnesota Vikings. And on behalf of Tyler Forness and myself, Dave Stefano, thank you so dearly for watching the Real Forno Show. SKOL, everyone.